Voilà, et nous avons le plaisir to welcome Olivia Arthur. Thank you, Olivia, for being here from London today. Thank you.
Donc rebonjour à tous. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier chaleureusement Monsieur Hirschhorn et Madame Pétrézine. Et j'ai à présent le plaisir de vous introduire Olivia Arthur, qui est donc photographe engagée de l'agence Magnum. Et de la même manière que tout à l'heure, Olivia étant anglophone, je vais continuer en anglais. Alors, I am very excited to welcome and present Olivia Arthur, who is a brilliant and committed British photographer, member of the Magnum Photography Agency. She first studied mathematics at Oxford University before moving towards photojournalism at the London College of Printing. She began working as a photographer in 2003 after moving to Delhi, and her numerous travels between Europe and Asia inspired her to work on a series about women and about East-West cultural divide. She has received support from the Inge Morat Award, the National Media Museum, Ojo de Pez Foto España Award for Human Values. And she published 2 books, the first one in 2012, The Jeddah Diary, about the lives of young women in Saudi Arabia, and the second in 2015, Strangers, presenting Dubai through the eye of a survivor of a shipwreck. It is for her great talent and vision that we are thrilled to welcome her today at Ecole du Louvre. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask up the back there, does this picture looks a little bit stretched to me, but I don't know if that, I was just looking at it. Did these proportions look right? Yeah?
Because you're close.
Maybe because of just, and on this one it looks very stretched, but okay. So, hi everyone and thank you. So I'm going to talk to you today, as it says up here, not so much as an artist using photography, but really as a photographer. And I wanted to kind of re-emphasize that after maybe some of the presentations that you've just been seeing and some of the work that you've been hearing about. But one of the things that for me is very important about being a photographer is that photography's an incredibly practical medium, and that's one of the things that I love about it. It's very practical, it's very accessible, and everybody in the world speaks photography in a way, or nearly everybody in the world, or some version of photography, and that's one of the things that I love about it, and that I think makes photography very powerful. One of the difficulties we have, or one of the harder parts of that, is reaching our audience. So as a photographer, I go out in the world and I take pictures of different things on many themes and many many human interest stories. But the point is, how do we get people to see them, and how do we reach the right audience? And that's something that I wanted to address in my talk here today, because I think it's one of the harder parts of what we do, becoming increasingly harder, I suppose, as the kind of medium changes, as the print medium disappears, and we kind of look for different ways to get our work to our stories seen. So I'm going to focus my talk today on India. It's a country that I've spent a huge amount of time working in. I actually began my career in India. So I think you mentioned there briefly my maths degree, but basically, which always seems to crop up. But basically, I had the opportunity to go and live in India back in 2002, and that's really where I learned to be a photographer. So it's a country that kind of taught me to be a photographer, that's kind of influenced more or less everything that I've done since. I've done a lot of work about women and looking at the kind of East-West cultural divide, and that comes from the experiences that I had when I was in India. So I just have to look at this again. Yeah, okay. So it's also a country I go back to a lot. I continue to make work in India, you know, on a regular basis. This is a kind of, these first few pictures are from an ongoing project that stretched from the time when I was living there back in 2002, 2003 to now, and it's in a way a collection of stories about differences and about the way people treat each other. And it's an incredibly complex subject. I mean, in India, anywhere in the world, it's something that, from a British perspective of living in India, I had this very strong feeling that our, you know, colonial history, our British class system, had a strong influence, you know, on the kind of huge divides that you have in the country, and not so much the huge divides, but the way people use those divides and the way people treat each other. And I'm not going to show you a lot of work from this project, but just a few things here, and it's as I say, it's an ongoing project. It's sort of a collection of different stories. I've traveled all over the country. I've followed many different stories that are about these kinds of class and caste divides. So this is a picture from an early morning in a village out in UP in kind of northern India, and these are sort of mountains made out of cow dung that they're drying it to use it to burn for making fires. And I have alongside this picture from Bombay. So this building right there on the left, that tall building, if you can see that, is the world's most expensive private residence. That's called Antilla. It's sort of one family lives in that building with 600 staff. So sort of I have these two as an introduction, just to give an idea of the kind of the scale of the difference that there is still there. A lot of the stories that I have there are much more specific, and they're in a way more journalistic. This is a picture taken at a wedding of a particular caste that had been fighting in a village with another caste, and so I've started sort of collecting these stories and going on these journeys to hear them. And to me, it's incredibly important to try and I go on these journeys to try and understand what the stories are about, to try and get some kind of a bigger picture. But you start to feel like a collector. So you're sort of collecting these stories. You're taking photographs of all these people and these things, and and there is some greater meaning. But the problem is, bringing it all together. So I've worked a lot with books. I've as I've mentioned, published 2 books, and I have this collection of stories sort of put together as a book. But I have this here, which is sort of in a way, this is just kind of my sort of chanting, just trying to understand what it's all about and how these things all link together. And in a way, I'm ready to put this together into a book. But the problem is, where do you go with it? What's the point if I make a book? I've made a couple of books in the past. I'll mention one of them just now, but these sorts of quite small limited edition artist books, which are very beautiful to look at, and they kind of reach a certain essentially wealthy audience, because they tend to be quite expensive. Photographic books are quite expensive. Which is not really the point, and it's become sort of frustrating after a while. I say that being a publisher myself, so I also run a small publishing house for photographic books. So I say that not that I think it's the wrong thing to do. I just feel a certain frustration in not being able to reach maybe as far as I'd like to with it. So this period that I spent in India, as I say, influenced a huge amount of what I've done ever since. One thing sort of leads to another, and I started a lot of the stories that I was working on in India, although they were never actually specifically about women or women's issues. They kind of always it always came back to that. I would always encounter the most the women whose stories particularly moved me, or whose stories I wanted to go back and tell, and I found myself, rather than wanting to tell those stories there, looking for this I spent many years looking for a crossover between a sort of Eastern and Western culture, and it took me to many different countries on many journeys, and finally it took me to Saudi Arabia, where I sort of found this extreme of East and West cultures together in a sort of strange contradictory muddle in a way. I mean, I went to Saudi Arabia because I was asked to teach a workshop, and I started making pictures, and I started trying to see what I could do. But I wanted to kind of show. I went there as the photographer, the documentary photographer, trying to show something of what I would find there, and trying to understand what life was like, for example, you know, in private in Saudi Arabia. But the more time I spent there, the more I found that when I was in private, I wasn't able to photograph, or there were certain boundaries, this idea of privacy of as a woman, what I was able to see was not the same as what I was able to photograph, and this sort of line between what I could show and what I couldn't show, and what you know, what you can see and what you couldn't see, became extremely complicated, and the sort of sets of rules that people had about that were not clear cut. It wasn't about, okay, this is what you're allowed to show, this is what you're not allowed to show. But every time I would meet different people, I would find new sets of rules, or the same people in different situations would have different sets of rules, and so I met many different women in all of these situations, and I tried to kind of bring it together. I almost didn't know what to do with this work, because it's very difficult to say, okay, this is what life is like in a place that people really don't know, because I think people really don't have a sense of what life is like inside homes in Saudi Arabia. It was I know that before I went, I tried to do some research to find out about it, and I found very, very little out. And then as a complete outsider, to then go and say, okay, this is what it's like, even though I couldn't even quite make out what it was like, or what I could say it was like, what I could show it was like, because most of the things that I saw I wasn't able to show. And I had to cover faces, and I have a lot of pictures where you like this, where I've kind of thrown a flash on the picture to conceal the identity, because they've let me take pictures that they don't want me to show. So this work, it's not really what I wanted to talk to you about today, but sort of to give you this background of how what I did in India really influenced everything I've done since. That really came out of that, and then that became my first book, Jeddah Diary. So in the end, with the book, what I did is I made it about, essentially I made it about myself, my experience. So my experience in this country as the outsider, trying to decipher this complicated set of rules, or different sets of rules, and it kind of became about the journey rather than the place, which is why I called it my Jeddah Diary. So coming back to India, I'm just going to keep an eye on the time. I wanted to talk to you, so I'm a photographer, talking to you about my personal projects, but I'm also a member of Magnum Photos, which some of you may or may not know. We're a collective of photographers, and Magnum does many things, but one of the best things that we are able to do is a group project, and we have, we're quite a number of different photographers across different countries around the world, different ages. We have many different perspectives and quite a few different styles or approaches. Of course, we're essentially a documentary photography agency, but I think that term can be used quite broadly. And one of the great things that we do, and we can come to a bigger project, is bring lots of different perspectives and approaches. So this is a project that I was involved in, I think, back in 2010. So 6 Magnum photographers were commissioned to go to India and make work about women. And so I put up the list. I don't know the full details of all the practicalities were coordinated by Magnum itself. Of course, the photographers, we went and we made the work. But it was a collaboration between Magnum, between BNP Paribas here in Paris, who were sponsoring it, and between Zuban Books, which is a sort of grassroots Indian feminist book publisher who published the book and helped coordinate the project. So we all went and worked on different themes. Here's a couple of pictures from what I did. I was working on kind of young women and kind of the new generation. These are biologists on a field trip from a lab in Bangalore. And this is Karuna Nandi. She's a human rights lawyer and activist, and she works in the High Court. And so then I've included a couple of pictures, a picture from each of the other photographers who were part of this. This is Raghu Rai, who did portraits of significant women in India, and I'm going to have to apologize because I don't remember this woman's name. This was Martine Frank, who went out to kind of the far west of India and photographed these women's groups. They're kind of I think it's called Sewa, and they're kind of women's groups that support each other to fund different projects. Patrick Zuckerman went and photographed women's panchayats, which are like local village governments. So kind of they're elected. They have, and so this was a panchayat leader who was a woman, and these are members of the community with her. And Alessandro Sanguinetti photographed women in Bollywood. And Alex Webb photographed female taxi drivers and female security guards. And then the whole project came together and was this nice book. But alongside the book, there was also an exhibition there was a whole series of exhibitions in Delhi, in London, in Paris, in Italy, in fact, all over. In fact, when I asked to get some of the installation shots from these shows, I was quite surprised to see how many different places it had been to. And so it went to all sorts of galleries all over. And I couldn't tell you which one is which, but there's a sort of selection. This is, again, some of my work. And then, so when they had these exhibitions, that gave Zuban and people around that the opportunity to organize. I think they organized various conferences and talks around it. So this is some of the kind of publicity that they had in India with this exhibition. I guess it went to various different venues across India. Again, and then there was this Reporters Without Borders put together their kind of annual, I think the annual book they do, and they put this together with the whole project. And then I was also surprised to discover that it had been in the Paris Metro as well. So that was nice to see. But again, and I guess this is an example of what. So as the photographers, we can go out and take the pictures, but something like Magnum and the publishers in India, and I suppose with the support of BNP Paribas, these pictures were able to get out quite far and be seen quite broadly. They're probably in many more places that I don't know about, but that was just kind of a little section of it. And I think, it's a nice example of how kind of collaborating with the different photographers, having the different visions from the different photographers, as well as working with the local organizations that we're able to kind of get a bit further out. Other people can get our photographs further out than we can. But that was a commissioned project. I also wanted to talk about a project that is, this is the kind of what I've been working on most recently in India. And this is a project that it came initially out of a commission from a photo festival in the UK and a photo festival in Bombay. So in Brighton in the UK and in Bombay in India, and it was for two of us. It was a collaboration with an Indian photographer, Bharat Sikar, and we were basically sent to each other's cities to go and photograph and work together. And so he photographed. We photographed alongside each other, and then we kind of decided to make two bodies of work that kind of complemented each other. He wanted to work in Brighton alone, and I worked in Bombay alone. And we were specifically asked to photograph LGBT communities. And it was something that I've always wanted to do, was to I suppose a lot of the work that I've done in the past has been about this idea of privacy, and I showed you some of the work from Saudi Arabia. It's about privacy and about what's these spaces that, people, what do people hide, what do people keep private, and so we were asked to make this work that talked about the LGBT community in Bombay, and we went to go and meet people and to photograph, and I wanted to make portraits of people, sort of intimate portraits of people in their private spaces. So again, kind of going into that sort of private domain, kind of asking, in some cases people wanted to do nude pictures, in some cases people didn't, but it was again just trying to get them in their most relaxed, most personal, at home. And sometimes we would go and we would ask if we could take pictures of them first thing in the morning when they've just woken up, so that there's that kind of feeling of people have let their guard down when they're first thing in the morning before they've had a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And we also did pictures outside. This was actually taken just before the Gay Pride march. And I reached out to people in lots of different ways. I initially, because Bharat is quite a well-known fashion photographer, he kind of had a lot of access to the fashion crowd in Bombay, so that was kind of our initial, our initial contact was with a sudden, coming back to what I was talking about before, a certain class. So amongst a certain class, it's kind of okay to be a bit more open. But we wanted to get beyond that. So we started reaching out to people on websites and on Grindr, on various different platforms, and I ended up in touch with this guy Jerry who likes to dress up. He's not transgender or anything. He likes to dress up in women's clothes, and he was really happy to meet me and to sort of do these photo shoots, because no one had ever before accepted him in this way. He'd once tried to tell his girlfriend about it, and she left him because she couldn't believe that he wasn't gay. And so we had a really nice relationship. We did a couple of shoots, and he's always writing to me, asking me when I'm going back to do some more photo shoots with him. And that's, through these kinds of interactions it really opened up, I think, for people there and for me to kind of meet people and to make these pictures. I should mention as well, I'm working on a very old camera. This is kind of a traditional, large format, old-fashioned camera, where you put the cloth over your head, and the whole process is very slow. And so it's not a case of just taking a picture. You kind of create a picture together. You talk about what kind of picture you're going to make, and they kind of understand what you want to do. It's a sort of slow and slightly collaborative process, and I really enjoyed that process with people, because I think it's very open, it's very honest, and you make a picture that they understand and that in the end they're happy to see. I think as a documentary photographer, I spent a lot of time going very quickly through people's worlds, through people's lives, and taking pictures that are not necessarily the ones that they want to see of themselves. And I've found with this work now, and this way of working, this much slower way of working, that I'm happy to be taking pictures that I know people are much more proud of. They're the pictures that they kind of want to see of themselves. So this James, he's a designer. So for him, he was someone who's he's a bit older, and he's someone who was able to come out in India some time ago and be relatively open about his sexuality. But for most of the people I photographed, that's not been the case. This, for example, Shivali, she comes from a very poor background, and she's so she's transgender. She's sort of halfway through having a sex change, and she's lucky to have the support of her mom, who lives with her, and they're sort of saving up for the full operation. But as I sort of, we were commissioned to make work about the LGBT community, and it's a really important thing in India. there's a law that non-heterosexual sex is illegal, and there's a whole cultural there's a cultural setting which makes it incredibly difficult. Look, it is okay to be openly gay. It's still difficult and complicated and not very widely accepted. But I also think that generally to be open about sexuality in that cultural setting, whatever sexuality is difficult for anyone. And for a lot of young people, they're expected just to get married, to have an arranged marriage, or to get married to the right kind of person, and get on and have a family. And I wanted to talk more broadly about sexuality and kind of sexual openness than just looking at this kind of community. And I became really interested in this idea of privacy and where people find privacy. So initially, of course, I was going to people's houses and asking them if I could photograph in their sort of private spaces. But what you have in the city there is this, enormous city with so many people is that people actually find their privacy if they're conducting a relationship that's not approved. They find their privacy in some of the most public spaces there are. So you have obviously down by the water in kind of very, as with many places, you have couples who go there, but you also have, and I heard a lot of stories about people finding each other in the trains and the kind of these packed commuter trains that they have. And you also have these areas along by the highway. So this gets really, really busy at night, and you have all the couples that come and hang out there. You even have the guys going up and down selling tea. It's kind of a hangout area. And so as I went, this is going back and making these portraits. This is a very well-known gay hangout, the McDonald's, and this was an after party after Gay Pride. And I'm going to go through these a little quickly because I wanted to just briefly talk about what I'm wanting to do with it. But in the same vein, so I sort of photographed in people's spaces. I made portraits. This picture became a little controversial because the work was going to be exhibited in these two photo festivals in Brighton and in Bombay, and we curated the exhibition together, and then at the last minute the festival freaked out and they said, we can't have this picture and this is not going to be okay. They're going to shut us down. And we were anyway forced to have the exhibition in a kind of very sort of exclusive private gallery, which was a sort of a shame for this, it was a photo festival that gets a lot of people into a lot of shows, and we wanted people to see it. And we wanted everybody who we photographed wanted to, was happy to have their photograph shown in the city to let people see it. And anyway, so we had a long discussion, but they wouldn't let us show this picture. And there was another one that I also had to pull out. And that's something that, for me, the festival were obviously nervous about what would happen to the rest of the festival if people got upset, if they were kind of charged with indecency. So there was another picture, which I'm coming to here. Because again, these are the spaces where people go and they go to meet people, they go to find a bit of privacy. This is down by the water. So this picture as well, I was not allowed to show. Again, these two girls were really happy for their picture to be shown. They said to me, we didn't know what kind of picture we'd be happy to make with you, but when we did the session, we felt really comfortable and we were really happy with it and we'd love it. They wanted it to be seen. But it was anyway. So we were not allowed to show it, and that's something that for me is a big shame because, of course, the festival has its sponsors. They have its, I understand, of course, but it's frustrating. And what I'd like to do now is find a way to be able to show the work. So here you've got some pictures of the installation. You can see Barrett's pictures colour pictures from Brighton alongside mine, and we sort of did this. And it was a very nice show, but it comes back to this sort of very classic gallery show in a location that they chose that, wouldn't get loads of, would be a little bit exclusive. Of course, it's a nice space, and and we were happy with the exhibition itself. But the question is, and this is another installation of the work that was in the not the V&A, the media space in the Science Museum in London. And they had a bit in the India exhibition. But the question for me is really how to get these out sort of further than that, and how to reach that broader audience, reach the people that the people who have been photographed were hoping that would see their pictures. So and as a publisher, I can make a beautiful artist book and put it out there, and I have this book that this is sort of, I put something together because I like I love to see the work in this form, and this is a poem by an Indian poet that I included in the back, and so there's a lot more material here. This is on the left a former woman, and on the right a former man, and again, they're just some examples of the work. But what I really want to do now is to find a way to bring this work. I'd love to make a kind of dual publication that has a sort of artist book, and then also, for example, there might be a newsprint version. There could be a newspaper that we could then distribute maybe through the LGBT community in Bombay to get it out there, to get it seen, and it's time is up. I'm at the end now anyway. So that's again the sort of question for me is how do we, people love photography. This wouldn't go out in any kind of mainstream way because in India they're very afraid of what the reaction would be if any of these kinds of photographs are seen, and so we have to find a way to share it. But as I say, it could be whether it could be a kind of a free publication that could be distributed within that community, which is quite a tight-knit community. But I'd love to see it kind of go further afield than that, and that's kind of where I'm at. That just at that point, trying to make this connection between making the work and reaching the audience, and that's kind of the difficulty, the end part that is always tricky, and that's always the most important. Really, there's no point in making this work if we just sit with it in our portfolios or in beautiful artist books that 1,000 people get to see, however many it is when we make an edition. But that's sort of the question for me now. That's something I'm asking myself a lot: is how do I take that further afield? And that is the last one.
Many thanks, Olivia.